They cut off the biggest statue of Egypt, 73 m long, 2021 m high. Someone asked Grok how old the Great Sphinx is. A simple question put to a machine with no tenure, no dig permit, no book to sell, and no reputation. A wrong answer could cost it. The expected reply was the one carved into every school book. Khafre, 2500 BC, case closed. That is not what came back. Instead, the AI kept circling the deep vertical channels gouged down the walls of the pit around the Sphinx. Rounded and undulating, the fingerprint of rain in a country where that rain stopped falling before Khafre music was born. The screenshots went everywhere. So, what is written in those walls? We talked about recently that I sent you was this new AI ability, that AI has the ability to translate some of these ancient languages now, which is really interesting. The shape in the pit. Start with the object because the object is not in dispute. 10 kilometers southwest of central Cairo on the Giza Plateau, there is a recumbent lion with a human face carved from a single ridge of soft yellow limestone. It runs roughly 73 m long and stands about 20 m high. It is not built. That distinction matters more than almost anything else in this story. The Sphinx was not assembled from blocks hauled in from a quarry somewhere else. It was subtracted. Someone chose a natural outcrop of Macodum Formation limestone, cut a horseshoe-shaped trench around it down into the bedrock. I think you can argue that the Sphinx is the most recognizable statue anywhere in the world. Its scale is immense. It's one single piece of stone, and left the animal standing in the hole they had dug. That trench is called the Sphinx enclosure. The walls of that trench are where this entire argument lives. The monument faces due east, not approximately east. Due east within a fraction of a degree, so that on the spring equinox, the sun rises directly into its line of sight. That alignment is measurable and uncontested. The answer given in almost every textbook, museum, placard, and documentary is Khafre, the 4th dynasty pharaoh, who built the second pyramid at Giza around 2500 BC. That attribution has been the professional consensus for over a century, and it has real arguments behind it which this script will go through properly rather than skipping past. It has never managed to shut the other side up because there is a problem in the stone, and the problem has been visible in photographs since the 19th century. For 30 years, the fight over it stayed exactly where it was. Geologists on one side, Egyptologists on the other, both certain, neither able to force the other to move. Then something arrived with no stake in either career, and several million people watched it read the file. What people started asking the machine? Grok is a large language model developed by XAI, Elon Musk's artificial intelligence company. It is built into X, the platform formerly called Twitter, which means anyone can query it in public and screenshot the result in seconds. That last detail is the entire reason this became a story. Through 2024 and 2025, users began doing the obvious thing. They pasted the Sphinx erosion argument into Grok and asked it to rule. The inventory stela has an inscription that goes back to about 4,600 years ago. And that inscription said that the Sphinx is a much older structure that the Egyptians adopted and repaired and venerated. Some asked flatly how old the Sphinx really is. Some fed it long extracts from alternative history books and asked whether the claims survived scrutiny. The results spread fast, and they spread because of what came back. In a great many of these exchanges, the model did not recite the textbook date and stop. It laid out the water erosion case at length. It acknowledged that the enclosure walls show a weathering profile more consistent with prolonged precipitation than with wind and blown sand. It named the geologists arguing for an earlier carving, and in some responses gave that hypothesis a serious share of the probability rather than filing it under fringe. To an enormous audience that read like a verdict. Here was a system with no grant cycle, no tenure committee, no publisher waiting on a manuscript, and no excavation permit that an antiquities ministry could quietly decline to renew. It had been handed the same file as everyone else, and it had not closed ranks. One caution has to sit here before anything else, and it will matter more at the end than it does now. A language model is not an instrument. It has never stood in that enclosure with a hand lens. It cannot measure a groove, run a weathering rate, or produce a single fact about Giza that was not already written down by a human being first, which turns the question around entirely. Not what did the machine reveal, but what is sitting in the human record that a reader with no loyalties keeps declining to discard. The first item on that list is water. The walls that were washed. Go down into the enclosure and look at the western wall, the one behind the Sphinx's hind quarters. It is the deepest cut in the whole excavation and the surface exposed longest. It is not flat. It runs in vertical fissures separated by rounded undulating ridges. The channels run top to bottom. The edges are soft. Nothing about it is angular. Robert Scow, a geologist with a Yale doctorate teaching at Boston University, was brought into the question in 1990 by John Anthony West, an independent researcher who had spent years arguing the Sphinx looked wrong for its date. West was not a scientist and never claimed to be. But look at beside you all there. You'd be looking at the Sphinx, at the art, not at the rocks. Jacques is a geologist, so what he's looking at are the rocks. What he wanted was a credentialed geologist willing to go and look at the rock. When expecting to confirm the standard chronology and fly home. He did not fly home with that. His reading presented to the Geological Society of America in San Diego in 1991 and published repeatedly since was that the rounded vertical channeling is the signature of precipitation. Rain falling on the exposed rim, sheeting down the vertical faces, exploiting the softer beds, dissolving and rounding the limestone across a very long span of time. He contrasted it with wind erosion, which works horizontally, bites hardest into the weaker bands, and leaves a sharper, more layered profile. That sharper profile does exist at Giza on tombs securely dated to the Old Kingdom. And Jacques argued the difference between those surfaces and the enclosure. What the Egyptologists say back. The orthodox position is not institutional stubbornness. And any fair version of this story has to give it full weight. Mark Leonard, the archaeologist who has spent more time mapping the Sphinx and its surroundings than almost anyone alive, argues that the monument is embedded in a 4th dynasty architectural system. The Sphinx temple sits directly in front of it. Khafre's Valley Temple sits beside it. The causeway running up to Khafre's pyramid, music, passes right by. Blocks used in the Sphinx temple appear to have been quarried out of the enclosure itself, which would mean the cutting of the trench and the raising of the temple were one operation. Undo that, and you have to explain why a temple built from the Sphinx's own waste rock happens to be Khafre's. Music. The geological rebuttal is equally specific. Lal Gori, a limestone specialist, argued that the rounded profile can be produced without heavy rain at all through salt crystallization and moisture cycling inside porous rock, a process that swells, flakes, and rounds a surface from within. James Harold proposed wet sand held against the walls during the long periods when the enclosure was buried, which would attack the stone chemically across millennia without requiring a green Sahara. Zahi Hawass, for years the public face of Egyptian antiquities, has rejected the older dating outright and has repeatedly returned to one objection above all others. No settlement debris, no music tools, no pottery, no waste, none of the material residue that a large organized workforce inevitably leaves behind has ever been found at Giza in the older range. That is the heaviest fact in the entire debate. Carving the Sphinx was not a weekend project. It meant removing thousands of cubic meters of rock and crews, food supply, tools, water, waste, organization on a scale that leaves rubbish. Rubbish is the thing archaeology is best at finding. At Giza, the rubbish that has been found is 4th dynasty, including the worker settlement Leonard excavated south of the plateau. There is a stylistic argument, too, which gets less airtime than it deserves. The headdress is a Nemes, the striped royal headcloth rendered in a way consistent with 4th dynasty convention. The face carries traces of the ceremonial beard and the cobra at the brow. Those are period markers. If the head was recut later, they belong to the recutting, which is precisely what the other camp would say. An Egyptologist looking at the whole figure sees coherent Old Kingdom royal iconography sitting inside an Old Kingdom architectural complex, and asks why that should be discarded on the strength of a weathering profile other geologists dispute. One position in the middle usually gets lost in the noise. The British geologist Colin Rear accepted that the enclosure weathering looks like rain damage, but concluded it pushed the carving back only a few centuries. Music into the early dynastic period, not a lost civilization. just an older Egypt than the label admits. So, the file has two strong sides and no knockout, which is exactly what makes the machine's behavior worth looking at in detail rather than in headline form. The Sphinx that we know today, the Sphinx from the Great Pyramids of Giza, is the most famous of all sphinxes. But there are sphinxes all over ancient Egypt. There are smaller sphinxes. There's an avenue full of sphinxes between the temples. What the machine actually returned, the screenshots that spread through 2025 were not one answer. They were hundreds, and the differences between them are more revealing than any single response. The first pattern is that phrasing moved the needle. Asked flatly how old the Great Sphinx is, the model would generally lead with Khafra and 2500 BC. Then note a minority geological challenge, asked to evaluate the water erosion evidence on its merits. It went the other way round, opening with Schock's reading of the enclosure walls, treating the rainfall interpretation as a live scientific position, and putting the orthodox date in the chair of the thing being tested. Same material, different center of gravity, depending entirely on where the question stood. The second pattern is what happened when people fed its source material. Users who pasted in long extracts from alternative history writers got answers that ran with that framing, elaborating on precession, lost inheritance, and catastrophe. Users who supplied nothing but the geological dispute got noticeably drier output, more hedging, more explicit flagging of what remained unresolved. The model was not adjudicating. It was extending whatever it had been handed. Music. The third pattern is the one that should be quoted back at everybody who treated these screenshots as a verdict. Across the neutral prompts, the objection Grok kept returning to as the strongest single argument against an earlier Sphinx was not stylistic and not architectural. It was the missing debris, the absence of old kingdom-scale settlement evidence, tools, pottery, and workforce residue anywhere in the older window. It surfaced that point repeatedly, unprompted, in exchanges people were screenshotting specifically to prove the establishment wrong. Notice what that means. The machine that supposedly broke ranks. What is under the pause? In 1991, alongside Schock's geological survey, a geophysicist named Thomas Debicki ran a seismic refraction study around the base of the Sphinx. Picture the practical reality. A working tourist site sealed for limited windows. A team laying out lines of geophones on the enclosure floor and putting shock waves into the ground, then recording how long the energy took to come back. Solid bedrock transmits differently from voids, and the difference shows up in the timing of the returns. You're not photographing anything. You are inferring shapes from echoes. Debicki's results published with Schock reported subsurface anomalies in the enclosure floor. One drew disproportionate attention. A rectangular feature beneath the front pause described as roughly 9 mx12 and lying several meters down. Rectangular is the operative word. Natural fracturing and dissolution in limestone tend to be irregular, following weaknesses and joints in whatever direction the rock allows. Right angles tend to be made by somebody. Debicki and SH also argued that weathering depth in the bedrock floor was uneven in a pattern supporting a longer exposure history on the older surfaces, an entirely separate strand of evidence from the enclosure walls. None of that proves an early date. A cavity could be a natural karst feature. Giza's limestone dissolves into hollows readily. It could be a later intrusion, a tomb, or a shaft from any of the periods that treated the plateau as sacred ground. In many ways, it was the mystery of the Sphinx that really broke everything open. It brought everything to the public attention. Egypt has run its own investigations over the years and has not announced any chamber. Permission is the real bottleneck, and it is not a conspiracy. Giza is among the most visited archaeological sites on Earth. The Sphinx is structurally fragile, and the plateau has been damaged before by well-intentioned intervention, including 20th century restoration work with the wrong materials that accelerated decay rather than stopping it. Any authority weighing a request to drill under the pause is weighing it against that record, which leaves the sharpest irony in the whole story. This is the one strand of the argument that is straightforwardly testable, and it is the one nobody has closed. Erosion can be reinterpreted. Proportions can be argued forever. Constellations can be projected onto anything. A void either exists or it does not. Modern ground-penetrating radar could map the shallow subsurface across that enclosure in a matter of days without removing a single stone. Muon tomography, the technique that detected a previously unknown large cavity inside the Great Pyramid in 2017, images density differences using cosmic ray particles passing through solid rock. Neither is exotic. Both are non-invasive. Between them, a definitive answer to a 30-year question is a scheduling problem, not a technical one. Asked about the anomaly, the model consistently declined to treat it as evidence of a chamber and consistently noted it had not been resolved by modern imaging, which is the accurate position and also an unusually precise summary of why the argument never ends. It also leads directly to the largest claim of all, and that one has nothing to do with Egypt, the hill that buried itself. Everything so far has concerned one monument. The idea that has done most to keep the Sphinx question alive comes from a hill in southeastern Turkey. Göbekli was excavated from 1995 by the German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt, and it broke the timeline. This is the oldest temple unearthed anywhere on this planet. What stands there are rings of massive T-shaped limestone pillars. The largest over 5 meters tall, and weighing many tons set upright in stone walls with 2 taller pillars standing at the center of each enclosure. The T-shape is not decorative. Several carry arms carved in low relief down their sides, and hands meeting at the front with belts and loincloths below. They are figures abstracted, faceless, deliberately not human in the face, standing in a circle facing inward. Across their surfaces runs a bestiary. Foxes with their teeth shown, boars, scorpions, vultures with wings spread. In one case above a headless human body, snakes descending in columns, cranes, aurochs, wild asses. The carving is confident, and it is not the work of people learning how to hold a chisel. The earliest phases date to around 9,500 BC. That is not a small adjustment. It is roughly 6,000 years before Stonehenge and the pyramids. It predates pottery, metal tools, writing, and settled agriculture in the region. It was raised, as far as the evidence shows, by people classified as hunter-gatherers, working with stone tools, quarrying pillars from bedrock a few hundred meters away, and moving them upright into position without draft animals or the wheel. Then comes the strangest part. The enclosures were not abandoned. They were filled in, deliberately backfilled with rubble, flint debris, and animal bone by the people who used them, buried under a mound that preserved them almost perfectly for 11,000 years. Whatever the reason, someone decided these rings should be put underground rather than left standing. Before Göbekli Leap, the standard model was clean. Farming produces surplus. Surplus produces settlement. Settlement produces hierarchy. Hierarchy produces monuments. Göbekli has that sequence in the wrong order. And Schmidt himself argued the temple may have come before the town. Nobody's serious disputes that this reordered the field. What is disputed is what it licenses. The strong reading favored by Hancock and others is that Göbekli tape is not an anomaly, but a survivor of an inherited body of knowledge with later builders copying forms they no longer understood. The claimed dating of the Sphinx sits close enough to that horizon to be folded into the same story along with a proposed catastrophe. The Younger Dryas. A violent climate reversal beginning roughly 12,900 years ago and ending around 11,700 years ago when a warming world slammed back into near glacial conditions before rebounding sharply. Some researchers have argued for a cosmic impact as the trigger, and that hypothesis remains genuinely contested in the literature rather than settled either way. The mainstream reading is far less romantic. By all accounts, we are